eat a healthy diet. I have 4 kids. My oldest daughter is 18, my youngest daughter is 10, and I have a daughter and son in between there. And when my oldest daughter was 14, she started telling me that she'd been having migraines off and on for several years, but she started to tell me she also was having trouble with her stomach. And this was news to me. She hadn't talked about it. She thought it was normal. And through some research that she was doing and reading, she came to me one day and she said, do you think maybe I need to? So I was like, I don't know. So I looked at what she was reading and I said, yeah, well, maybe this makes a sense. It's worth trying. And at that point, we knew only a few people who were gluten-free. And got out enough things to do the basics. We knew one family who was, and they gave me this helpful cheat sheet of how to read labels and things. So we did that, and within a month, she was not having any more migraines. And she was starting to say that maybe her, so that really, really caught my attention. And I started having to rethink my whole baking life, because all these years I had done what everybody else does, and I didn't know anything about gluten-free flours or any of that stuff. So that summer, I learned how to bake differently, get new flours in my house that I had never heard of before. And one of the things I found in that time was a book called The Vintage Remedies Guide to Bread, and there I learned a lot about sourdough, incorporating sourdough in. And then a few months later, she decided maybe she needed to go dairy-free as well, and then it went from there. And I can tell that story, or we can wait a little bit. It depends. Do you want me to go into the rest of her story right now? Okay. So I started really researching, and I found something called the GAPS diet, which is a healing diet for gut health and designed to heal and seal the gut. And so I started it, and it involved going grain-free, not just gluten-free, and it looked pretty complicated. And I talked to her about it, I suppose, for about 4 or 5 months before she finally said, and I didn't pressure her. She was 14 at the time. I knew at that point if she was going to do the diet, she had decided she wanted to do it. I wasn't going to make her do it. And after a few months of discussing, she said to me one day, I think I'm ready to go grain-free and get ready to do this GAPS diet. So the following April, she was just over 15. She did the full GAPS about a year. It was a really rough year, and she will say it was one of the roughest years of her life because of how much food she couldn't have. Social events were terrible because she had to bring her own food to them. But after, on different parts of the GAPS diet, she was in a much, much better place. That was a few years ago. Since then, we've had ebbs and flows. She continues to be gluten-free. She continues to be dairy-free. She goes back and forth on what she has of grains and what she doesn't. But I will say, she's 18. She is healthy. She is strong. She is. Her plans are to become a fitness instructor, which means you have to be very strong and healthy for that. And she is. She just cannot eat food without thinking about what she's eating. She eats very clean, and she does not eat out hardly at all. She does pretty much prepares her own food to take along. In some situations, she can eat some things, but she does eat a lot of vegetables. She eats meat. She eats fruits. She just doesn't eat a lot of grain, and she's pretty careful, like just like a gluten-free oats when she has oats and things like that. And no, she will never eat wheat or any of the wheat family again. I'm quite sure about that. After that time, a few years ago, we put my husband on the gluten-free diet, and it made a big difference for him from some neurological symptoms he had. Plus, as would go with more with the guy lost 30 pounds without doing anything else different. It made me a little bit frustrated because I can't lose 30 pounds like that. And then my youngest daughter, I put on gluten-free soon after I put my oldest one on because she had some vague symptoms too, and I have continued to keep her gluten-free. She's very well. And then I went gluten-free last December for an autoimmune esophageal issue called eosinophilic esophagitis, and that has improved a lot since I've gone gluten-free. And for the record, I haven't lost 1 single pound because I'm gluten-free, and my husband did. So, but I have 2 family members who will still eat gluten, but we really don't have it in the house except for when I make sourdough bread, which does have some gluten in it, but it's fermented out over 24 hours. So that's pretty much, in a nutshell, our gluten-free story. Okay. What was that?
About gluten today, where we did not hear about this.
Yeah. My research, I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one reason is the amount of pesticides that are in many of our grains, especially our gluten grains, wheat and things like that. The Healthy Home Economist had a really interesting article about that 5-6 months ago, maybe, that she was arguing that it had a lot to do with the pesticides on the wheat. I also think it has a lot to do with the hybridization of the grains. It seems that people who are just somewhat sensitive can eat some of the ancient grains like emmer or einkorn, some of those grains having anywhere near the same reaction. So it seems to be the changing of the grains to make them more productive, to make the gluten higher, that kind of thing seems to be a big factor. And I think that it's just for our gut health is in this, at this stage of our country. We've had years and years of antibiotics, we've had years and years of pesticides, we've had years of vaccines, all kinds of things, and all of that stuff I think has contributed to really a very poor gut health in the general population. And the first thing to go when your grains are very different, and wheat, and with the gluten protein in it in particular, so that's going to be the first thing that's going to bother people. So I think, like with anything, it's a multifaceted answer. It's not just one thing that's going on. And what it is in my family, I'm not sure, but I'm assuming it's kind of a combination.
Does everybody need to go gluten-free? Or just some of us? And why should we consider this in our kids?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question. Because I haven't made everyone in my family gluten-free. There's still 2 family members who aren't. If you have a question, I do really think pretty much everyone should give a trial. And a trial, gluten-free trial, should be at least 2 months, I think, and really ideally 3 to 4. You really can't see things. I had somebody recently mention they were going to try a 2-week gluten-free trial with their child. You're not going to find the body's still beginning to clear things out of it before, so you can't really test. I do think there are people who don't seem to have a negative reaction to gluten. I didn't think I did, though. And then I realized that when I did a very specific testing, I did end up. So I guess I would say, if in doubt, if you can't pinpoint with your children, if you have just vague complaints, if you're bothered by behavior that you see that doesn't seem to be dealt with other ways, it's really worth a try. The thing with gluten-free, you can't just say, well, I'll just have gluten once a month. It doesn't work that way. You either go gluten-free or you don't. And I still have, every once in a while, my husband will cheat and have a little something, and I keep saying, you don't get it. You don't get it, because it's the gluten gets you can contaminate your body for weeks afterwards. When my oldest daughter, who's by far the most sensitive, has gotten what we call glutened and has by accident gotten some gluten, it can take a month until she stops reacting with GI symptoms and with skin, with like eczema type symptoms. So I guess to summarize that answer is, everyone doesn't have to, but you don't know unless you do a trial. And if some people in your family are, it really is much easier to just have everybody be at least at home, because then you don't have to bring the gluten in your house. So now the other thing that
what's the biggest benefit?
the biggest benefits when you go gluten-free, well, less complaints and happier people. I mean, like I said, with my kids, much less GI complaints, because that's something with both of them. And just kind of, I think there's also often a relationship with my oldest daughter. There was some relationship to anxiety as well. And when she went gluten-free, we saw a big difference in that. She went from being a really fearful person to being much calmer and much just not fighting with anxiety. And I've had a lot of conversations with people who they've got a child who's really anxious. I just spoke with a woman yesterday. Her teenage son is very OCD and has a lot of anxiety. And I said, why don't you try this? It made a difference, or at least may not clear it up completely, because ultimately I think you don't just, taking out gluten is only really step one of dealing with gut health. But she seemed very interested, so I hope she gives it a try. Yeah, I just think and the other thing, on the negative side, that learning curve is really steep initially, but I can tell you, you get used to it. It gets easier, much easier. It takes a few weeks, a few months, but there is wonderful, helpful blogs on the internet with really great recipes, all that kind of stuff, that it's much easier to do that, I think, than it was some years ago. And although I don't recommend buying loads of gluten-free substitutes for all your favorite things, there are some substitutes, and doing a small amount of some processed gluten-free substitutes can really help ease the transition.
So that's what I'd like to talk about now. Going gluten-free and making that resolve is one thing, making it happen is another thing.
Yeah, where do we start? Okay, I think the very easiest, the most kind of basic step you can do is cut out processed foods and start doing, there's a lot of foods that are naturally gluten-free. Vegetables, fruit, meat, like all those things are gluten-free. If you don't eat a real foods diet, start making those transitions and get used to doing some cooking. It's the processed foods that either have gluten in them or they have some of the things that we have to watch out for that can be that can also have gluten, things like maltodextrin. Trying to think, the other ones are blanking out on the other. There's a bunch of other things reading labels, and so getting rid, if you're using whole foods, there'll be contaminants that might be in that might have gluten in them, and that would be another step, is learn to read labels. Thirdly, the one thing I haven't talked about that has been a huge help to my family overall with the gluten-free is using sourdough. And I mentioned the book Vintage Remedies, which was a really life-saving book for me. And there have been a lot of tests done, even with celiacs, that when they have sourdough that's been fermented 24, 48, maybe even 64 hours, the amount of gluten in the bread is not even measurable anymore, and they've been able to eat it. Now, my daughter, the oldest one, is scared even of sourdough, so I'm not going to make her eat it. But the rest of the family does eat that. And I have a sourdough starter that I've had for years. The best way to get a sourdough starter is, if you know anybody with one, you can get one, and then you just take care of it from there. Or you can purchase them. Cultures for Health has some really good sourdough starters, or you can find recipes and just make your own from scratch. When I mix up my sourdough, I use wheat flour and white flour, and it sits 12 hours in my big bread bowl, and then I shape it into loaves, and then it sits another 12 hours, and then I bake it. And it has not bothered any of the rest of us who have gone gluten-free. And you can make almost anything baked sourdough. I've made sourdough pretzels. I've made the big soft ones. I've made sourdough cinnamon rolls. I've made sourdough rolls, sourdough biscotti. There's all kinds of things you can do. And again, there's a lot of wonderful recipes. And it's the same thing. There's a learning curve, but once you get it, it's easy to work with, and you learn how to adapt. You can look at a yeast recipe and say, okay, I know how to make that sourdough. You're not going to know that the first week or two, but after a while, you start to realize, oh, this is how you do it. And that has been really helpful and allowed us to have some more, I guess, kind of what I would call normal foods. I found my biggest frustration initially was finding a decent bread recipe. And the sourdough solved that problem. For sandwiches or tortillas or things like that, like some of the gluten-free substitutes that there were. And if you look at a lot of the gluten-free breads, they have almost nothing of nutritional value. It's a lot of starch, because starch is what makes something taste like what we're used to, but it has really almost no nutritional value. And that's what you do have to watch out for with the substitute products, which is kind of where we're going next, is gluten-free products at the store. There are some okay ones, but a lot of them are really just no nutrition. And I have read often people who said they went gluten-free and 6 months later they had gained 15 pounds, 20 pounds. And like, what's this? And it's because they didn't replace it with whole foods. They went directly into the gluten-free products, and they weren't getting nutrition, and they're getting the calories. So that's something you really have to watch out for, because you will get rid of the gluten, but you won't be healthier. And ultimately, we're doing this to be healthier, not just to be part of the. So.
Thank you. That answers my next question about buying food from the store What resources can you recommend to people who are trying to make this transition? People who are, talk about your blog a little bit.
I have a section on my blog at Purposeful Nutrition that is a gluten-free tab where I have all the articles that I've written. One of them in there is an article where I listed 10 of my favorite gluten-free blogs. I don't do lots of recipes on my blog, so I wanted to link to some of my favorite recipe bloggers. Some of them include Brittany Angel. She was a real lifesaver for me initially, and I really like her cookbooks. I have a couple of them. Gluten-free on a Shoestring is another one I've really liked what she's done, and she changes almost anything that you can look for. If you want to make it gluten-free, she's already done the recipe on it. Alaida's Pantry is another one. She does a lot with the grain-free flours, almond coconut flour. Those were flours I had never heard of before, and now they are an integral part of my kitchen, and I really like working with both of them, and I've found some really, really great recipes. The Spunky Coconut has a lot of coconut flour recipes that are really good. In fact, I think it might have been her blog. My mother-in-law is Swedish, and we celebrate the St. Lucia Day in December, and one of the things you make for that is the St. Lucia buns. And the first year that this all happened, I went looking for a Lucia bun recipe that was gluten-free, and I found this one. And when I made it with coconut flour, it was better than the regular gluten buns that I had made. I was like, wow, I'm really impressed here. Again, you have to get used to working with the different flours. Another one, Gluten-Free Girl and the Chef. She was real helpful to me initially too. She had a recipe on her blog for making your own gluten-free flour mix, and it was one where she gave you like a choice of like 12 different and about 5 or 6 different starches. And as I use a 70-30% mix, and what I really liked is people gave me tools. I needed tools. I didn't want to be dependent on having to find a specific recipe the rest of my life. I want it this way. And then, the Vintage Remedies Guide to Bread. But there's some really great cookbooks out there that have been, and I have some cookbook reviews on my blog too, where I mentioned some of the different ones, where I did the reviews, and they've just been, it's just good to have a couple of them in the kitchen, just so you can pull a book off the shelf sometimes when you don't know what else to make, and you've got something to work with. So.
Thank you, Jennifer. What do you think is the hardest part about going gluten-free, and which stopping there from time?
I would say 2 things. One is just the learning curve initially. So like the first few months, once you get through that, though, you don't ever have to go back through that learning curve. The other thing is just that it's more mainstream than it was even 5 years ago, but it's still very, very hard in public gatherings. If you go to potlucks, if you go to relative's house for a holiday meal or whatever, it's just hard because your kids, you can't eat everything that's out there. When we do a potluck, I try to make sure that I take a main dish that I know they can eat, and sometimes also, depending on how people are depending what's going on with my family, sometimes I also make sure I have a dessert, because that's usually it's the desserts that aren't gluten-free. But you can't do it unless you take your own pasta dish, for instance. All the macaroni and cheese and all the lasagna, all that stuff is usually not going to be gluten-free unless you got some other gluten-free people or families who are part of whatever group you're in. But I have found my kids seem very used to that now. And like I said, as long as I know that they can eat, and we were just at a potluck, gluten-free brownies along, and you know, my youngest one, when we were done, I didn't even put them out for everybody because there were only a couple. I was like, "Do you want a brownie?" She's like, "Yes." So as long as there's something along, usually they don't mind anymore. But initially it's hard to get used to. And pizza parties are incredibly difficult because you can't eat their pizza. You know, so you look for other families who are doing the same thing, and that can really help if you're in a group like that. Where and with holiday meals, if you're not going to be hosting the holiday meal, talk to whoever is and say, "Can I bring such and such? What are you making? You know, what are you making?" Most people are willing to accommodate to a certain degree, but the biggest thing sometimes is education. I mean, I've had people who said, "Well, it's okay if I just put 1 spoonful of flour in it, right?" It's like, no, you can't do that. The flour is where the gluten is. So you really do have to ask questions. and you just, there are people who get offended, and that can be hard, but the average person does want and does want to make it better for you. They just don't always understand. So explaining to them can help.